A toucan appeared every morning at 6 a.m. when she learned why she cried. The toucan landed at precisely 6 o'clock in the morning, when the light was still a pale veil filtering through the high leaves, and the forest smelled of cold earth and sleeping water. The impact was soft but deliberate, on the same cecropia tree facing the stilt house, the enormous yellow beak catching what little light existed and holding it like a blade. The bird didn't simply arrive. It positioned itself with precision, body angled toward the open door where darkness still pooled thick and blue. Inside that darkness lay a scarlet macaw, her body rigid against the woven basket that served as her recovery nest. Her wings pressed tight against her sides, as if the memory of falling was still etched into every feather the storm had torn loose 3 nights before. The macaw's eyes tracked movement outside, but didn't focus, didn't latch onto anything specific. Her breathing came shallow and quick, the rhythm of prey rather than predator. The toucan called once. The sound cut through the morning silence like a branch snapping, dry, melancholic, sharp. Then silence returned, heavier than before. The bird remained motionless on its perch, the massive beak tilted slightly downward, aimed directly at the shadowed doorway. Minutes passed. The forest began its layered awakening. First the insects, their collective hum rising from the understory like heat. Then the smaller birds, testing territorial calls. Finally, the howler monkeys in the distance, their voices rolling through the canopy like distant thunder. The toucan waited through all of it. When no response came from inside the house, it spread its wings, a sudden burst of black and yellow and red, and lifted into the canopy. But it didn't go far. From a higher branch, partially concealed by hanging vines thick as a man's arm, it continued watching. The old woman emerged an hour later, her movements slow and deliberate as she descended the wooden steps, slick with morning dew. She carried a metal bowl filled with water and moved toward the river's edge where she knelt to rinse it. The toucan tracked every gesture. On the second morning, the bird returned at the exact same minute. The light held the same quality, that suspended moment between night's end and day's true beginning. This time the toucan called twice, the second cry slightly different in pitch, more insistent. Inside, the macaw shifted position for the first time since the rescue, her head lifting a fraction of an inch before settling back down. The movement was small, but significant. Pain rippled through her damaged wing, the kind of deep ache that speaks of torn muscle and bruised bone beneath the feathers. The woman heard the toucan's call from inside, where she was preparing cassava flour, her hands working the grater with practiced rhythm. She paused, turned her head toward the open window. Through the gap in the rough-cut boards, she could see the distinctive profile of the toucan against the grey-green morning. For a moment, their eyes seemed to meet, though she knew better than to assign too much meaning to such things. The forest was full of birds. Toucans were common enough. But on the third morning, when the bird appeared again at precisely 6, something shifted in her perception. This wasn't coincidence. This wasn't territorial behavior or random foraging. The woman set down the coffee she was heating on the small wood stove and moved to the doorway. She didn't step outside, didn't make herself obvious. Instead, she stood just inside the threshold, her body half in shadow, and watched. The toucan called its same greeting. This time, impossibly, the macaw responded. The sound was broken, barely audible, more breath than voice, but unmistakable. The woman's skin prickled with something she couldn't name. She'd lived on this river for 43 years, had seen storms tear houses from their stilts, had watched the forest swallow clearings back into itself within months, had witnessed the endless cycle of birth and death and birth again. But this felt different. This felt like communication. By the 4th morning, she was awake before the toucan arrived. She stood in the doorway with her coffee, the tin cup warm against her palms, and waited. The forest emerged from darkness in stages. First the shapes, tree trunks solidifying from shadow, the curved line of the river becoming visible against its banks. Then the colors, the grey-green of leaves, the brown-black of water, the red clay of the exposed riverbank where the last flood had chewed away the earth. Finally, the details, individual branches, the texture of bark, the ripples on the water's surface where fish were already feeding. The toucan came on schedule, but this morning it brought something in its beak, a small purple fruit, already split open, juice darkening the yellow-orange bill. The bird held the fruit for several seconds, then deliberately dropped it. The fruit hit the porch roof, rolled, and stopped at the edge near where water collected in a depression, worn smooth by years of rain. The toucan called, waited, called again. The woman understood this was an offering, though she couldn't have explained how she knew or what it meant. She retrieved the fruit, held it in her palm, studied its weight and texture. Then she moved inside to where the macaw lay in her basket. The bird's eyes were open, alert. The woman placed the fruit near the edge of the basket, within reach. The macaw didn't move toward it immediately, but her head tilted in acknowledgement. Her nostrils flared slightly, taking in the scent. Outside, the toucan waited until mid-morning before departing. This pattern held for days. Each morning at 6, the same arrival. Sometimes the toucan brought fruit. Sometimes it simply called and watched. The macaw began responding more consistently, her voice gaining strength though still fractured, still carrying the weight of trauma. The woman observed this ritual while maintaining her own routines. She checked her fish traps each morning after the toucan departed, pulling up woven baskets that sometimes held silver-scaled pirapitinga, sometimes only riverweed and debris. She tended her small garden plot where tomatoes struggled against the humidity and peppers thrived. She washed clothes in the river, scrubbing fabric against smooth stones she'd collected specifically for that purpose. And each evening she prepared food for herself and for the macaw. Soft fruits mashed into paste, seeds carefully cleaned, water changed twice daily. The macaw's recovery was slow. For the first week she could barely lift her head for more than a few minutes. The damaged wing hung at an awkward angle, and any attempt to extend it brought visible distress. The woman had seen enough injured animals to know this one might never fly again. The thought settled in her chest with familiar weight. The forest didn't permit weakness. An adult macaw that couldn't fly was already dead. It simply hadn't stopped moving yet. But something about the toucan's persistence made her hesitate to accept that conclusion. On the 8th morning, when the toucan arrived, the macaw pulled herself to the edge of her basket. The effort was enormous, visible in every small movement. Her claws gripped the woven palm fiber, her body trembling with exertion. She managed to lift her head high enough to see out the doorway to where the toucan perched. For the first time, they made extended eye contact. The moment stretched, held by some invisible tension. Then the toucan called, not the usual greeting, but something softer, almost questioning. The macaw responded with a sound the woman had never heard from her before, a low, sustained note that held neither aggression nor fear, just acknowledgement, connection. The woman felt tears prick at her eyes and was surprised by them. She'd thought herself beyond this kind of sentimentality. She wiped her face with the back of her hand, rough skin against rougher skin, and went back to her coffee. But from that morning forward, she couldn't deny it anymore. Something was happening here. Something that went beyond instinct or coincidence. In that small house at the margin of the dark river, in the presence of a wounded macaw and a persistent toucan, a pattern was emerging that she didn't fully understand but could no longer ignore. The macaw carried memories in her body that were more texture than image. The night the sky had split open played itself out not as a sequence of events, but as a series of physical sensations that lived in her muscles, her bones, her shortened feathers. Lightning had illuminated the canopy in flashes that burned white-hot behind her eyes even now. Wind had become a physical force, not just air in motion, but something solid that could tear branches thicker than her body and send them spinning into darkness. She remembered the nest, their nest, built with her mate over the course of 2 full seasons. They'd chosen a hollow in a Brazil nut tree, high enough to discourage climbing predators, but sheltered enough to protect eggs from the harshest rains. They'd lined it with softened bark and leaves, had arranged each piece with the instinctive precision that came from generations of macaws before them. It had been perfect. It had been home. Then came the night when perfection meant nothing. The storm arrived without the usual warnings. No gradual darkening of the sky, no initial sprinkle of rain. One moment the evening was settling into its normal rhythms, frogs beginning their calls, bats emerging to hunt, and the next moment the world exploded into chaos. The wind hit first, a sustained roar that bent the entire forest canopy sideways. Rain followed immediately after, not falling but being driven horizontally with enough force to strip leaves from branches. The macaw and her mate had pressed themselves into the hollow, bodies tight together, trying to become small. But the tree itself was moving, swaying with a violence that made the hollow's entrance trace wild arcs through the darkness. Then came the lightning strike. It hit a tree 3 canopy layers away, but the sound was instantaneous and absolute, a crack so loud it ceased to be sound and became pressure, became pain. In the disorientation that followed, the macaw's mate pushed forward, perhaps trying to see if the entrance was blocked, perhaps simply panicked beyond reason. She felt him leave the hollow's safety. She called out, a scream that was lost immediately in the storm's roar. She pushed forward herself, driven by instinct and bond, emerging into wind that immediately caught her wings and threw her sideways. For a moment she fought it, wings beating hard against the gale. She glimpsed her mate below, a flash of red against dark leaves, struggling to land on a branch that was whipping like a snake. Then something hit her. She never saw what, only felt the impact against her left wing, a pain so sharp and complete it erased everything else. Her wing folded wrong. The wind caught her differently now, spinning her, and she was falling. The last thing she remembered clearly was the sound of branches breaking as she crashed through them, each impact another burst of pain, another disorientation. Then darkness, not the darkness of night, but the darkness of nothing, of consciousness shutting down to protect itself from overload. She'd woken to gentler sensations, the smell of smoke, wood smoke, cooking smoke, the kind that meant humans, the smell of soap, simple and clean, the smell of the river, thick with sediment and fish and growing things, and hands, careful hands, lifting her into something soft, a voice, low and steady, speaking words she couldn't understand, but whose tone conveyed something other than threat. Not safety, not yet, but not danger either. Now, lying in the woven basket with her wing still wrong, still unable to fully extend, the macaw existed in a state between recovering and giving up. Each morning she woke to the same internal crisis, the overwhelming instinct to fly warring with the absolute impossibility of flight. Her body wanted to launch, to rise, to join the morning calls echoing through the canopy. But when she tried to shift position, pain bloomed immediately through the damaged wing, sharp enough to stop all movement. The toucan's appearance had added a new element to her daily experience. At first, she'd been too deep in pain to notice much beyond the sound. Just another bird call in a forest full of bird calls. But as days passed and her awareness sharpened, she began to recognize the pattern, the same time, the same tree, the same distinctive call. Something in the consistency was comforting. In a world that had become unpredictable and hostile, where her own body had betrayed its most basic purpose, the toucan's reliability was an anchor point. She found herself waiting for it each morning, her body tensing slightly in the minutes before 6 o'clock, then relaxing when the call came as expected. She didn't understand what the toucan wanted. She didn't think in those terms, want, intention, purpose, beyond immediate survival. But her body responded nonetheless. When the toucan called, her feathers smoothed slightly, her breathing deepened. Some part of her recognized this as a type of companionship, even if she lacked the framework to name it as such. The offerings of fruit confused her initially. Food came from the woman, from the careful hands that placed mashed pulp near her beak twice daily. But fruit dropped from the sky from a toucan's beak, arriving with a soft thud on the wooden roof above. This didn't fit her established patterns. The first time it happened, she'd ignored it entirely. The second time, she'd tracked the fruit's fall with her eyes but made no move toward it. The third time, hours after the toucan departed, hunger and curiosity finally drove her to stretch her neck far enough to reach it. The fruit tasted different from what the woman provided. It carried the flavor of height, of canopy living, of the world she'd been torn from. The macaw ate it slowly, each bite releasing memories stored in her body, the feeling of powerful wings lifting her above the understory, the rush of air through primary feathers, the calls of her mate answered and answering. The pain of those memories was almost worse than the pain in her wing. She'd lost more than the ability to fly. She'd lost her place in the complex social structure of macaw life. She'd lost her territory, her routine, her future. The nest they'd built was gone. Her mate was gone, though she didn't know this with certainty, only felt his absence as a constant wrongness, a missing echo where there should have been response. When the toucan arrived on the 8th morning and their eyes met with real focus for the first time, something shifted in the macaw. Not understanding, not hope exactly, but recognition. This bird, this persistent morning visitor, was offering something, not food alone, not protection, something more fundamental: attention, witness, the acknowledgement that she existed, that she was seen, that her struggle wasn't happening in isolation. The macaw returned the call with a sound she hadn't known she could still make, lower than her usual register, sustained and deliberate. It was the beginning of something, though she had no way of knowing what. The toucan's own memory of loss was carried differently, but just as deeply. Unlike the macaw, whose trauma had been sudden and singular, the toucan's grief had come in two waves, separated by weeks, but connected by the same storm system that had torn the canopy apart. The first loss was his mate. They'd been together for 3 seasons, their bond renewed each year through the elaborate courtship rituals that toucans performed, the passing of fruits back and forth, the synchronized movements along branches, the duets that echoed through the morning forest. They'd raised 2 young successfully, had learned each other's rhythms and preferences, had developed the kind of efficiency that comes from repeated cooperation. The storm that eventually destroyed the macaw's nest had begun its work days earlier, upstream where the river narrowed and the forest grew denser. The toucan and his mate had weathered the first night successfully, pressed together in the hollow of a dead tree that had somehow remained standing through previous storms. But the second night brought worse. Rain fell so heavily it became a physical presence, a weight that pressed down on everything. Visibility dropped to nothing. The world became only sound and water. A tangle of vines came loose upstream, a massive knot of vegetation that had probably been accumulating for years in the high branches. The floodwaters caught it and sent it tumbling downriver with devastating force. It hit their roosting tree with enough impact to snap the trunk. The toucan had time to launch himself into the rain-dark sky, wings fighting for purchase against wind and water. His mate emerged a second later, but the tree was already falling. A branch caught her, pinned her against another trunk, and the water rose around her with horrifying speed. The toucan circled, calling desperately, but the rain and wind made flight nearly impossible. He landed on a nearby tree, gripping the bark with claws that ached from the effort of holding on. He watched the water rise. He watched his mate struggle and then stop struggling. He watched the river take her when the branch finally broke. For days afterward, he'd searched the riverbanks downstream, looking for her distinctive feathers, for any sign. He found nothing. The forest had simply consumed her, recycled her back into its endless cycle. The hollow where they'd roosted became unbearable. He abandoned it, began moving lower in the canopy, closer to the water where he could watch the river's constant flow. It was irrational. He knew this in the way animals know things without words, but he couldn't stop himself. The second loss came 3 weeks later. He'd encountered another toucan, a younger male, during this period of wandering. They weren't bonded, but had developed a loose companionship, the kind of association common between toucans who found themselves without mates or territories. They foraged together, roosted near each other, shared the silence that followed loss. Then the big storm hit, the one that finally destroyed the macaw's nest and scattered birds across miles of forest. The 2 toucans had taken shelter in a cecropia grove near the river's edge. These trees, with their hollow trunks and quick growth, weren't ideal for weathering storms, but options were limited. They'd settled into adjacent hollows, calling back and forth to maintain contact through the darkness. The flooding came fast. The river rose 10 feet in as many minutes, driven by rainfall upstream and the collapse of a temporary dam. A massive log, still carrying its root system like a grotesque crown, came tumbling through the rapids. It struck the base of the younger toucan's tree with enough force to split the trunk. The tree toppled sideways, the hollow filling with water instantly. The older toucan heard his companion's distress call, a sound cut short mid-note, then silence. When morning came and the waters receded, he found the younger toucan's body tangled in the roots of a fallen tree, already being worked over by insects and opportunistic caimans. The toucan didn't stay to watch. Some instinct drove him away, back toward higher ground, back toward the territory where he'd once lived with purpose and pattern. That's when he encountered the old woman for the first time. He was flying low, still somewhat disoriented, when he saw her at the river's edge. She was pulling something from the debris, something red and limp. As he watched from his perch in a nearby tree, she carefully lifted the macaw, cradling its body against her chest as she navigated back up the muddy bank to her stilt house. The gentleness of her movements struck him in a way he couldn't have explained. In a world that had recently shown him only violence, the violence of storms, of rising water, of breaking trees, here was a different kind of force, careful, deliberate, protective. He watched her disappear into the house with the macaw. He stayed in the tree, watching, until darkness made further observation impossible. He returned the next morning without planning to. Something pulled him back. Not curiosity exactly, but a need to see what came next. The macaw was still alive. He could hear its labored breathing through the open door. The woman emerged with water, with food, with cloth to clean the bird's matted feathers. She worked with patience the toucan recognized instinctively. This was someone who understood what recovery required. On the third morning, watching the woman tend to the macaw, something crystallized in the toucan's awareness. He'd lost his mate. He'd lost his companion. He'd watched the forest's indifferent violence take them both. But here was evidence that another path existed. Here was proof that not all losses were final, that damage could be addressed, that care was possible even in the midst of general chaos. He began calling to the macaw that morning, not because he expected response, not because he understood what he was doing in any conscious way, but because some deep instinct told him this was necessary. Connection mattered, presence mattered, witness mattered. He started bringing fruit on the fourth day. This was behavior he'd performed before, with his mate, as part of their bonding ritual. But this felt different. He wasn't courting. He was offering something more fundamental, a bridge between the world of flight and freedom that he still inhabited and the world of injury and confinement where the macaw was trapped. Each piece of fruit was a reminder that the canopy still existed, that life continued above, that the macaw's world wasn't limited to the basket and the house and the woman's careful hands. When the macaw finally responded to his call on the 8th day, something in his chest loosened. He'd been carrying tension he hadn't recognized until it released. The sound she made was broken and weak, but it was real. It was answer. It was proof that his persistence had meaning, that his morning visits were creating something that mattered. The toucan didn't think in terms of redemption or purpose or healing through helping others. But his body knew what his mind couldn't articulate, that in tending to this connection, in maintaining this daily ritual, he was rebuilding something in himself. The grief remained, the loss remained, but alongside it now was this new pattern, this morning structure, this reason to rise at dawn and fly to a specific tree and call out into the possibility that something would call back. The real threat came without warning, the way the Amazon's most dangerous moments always did. The day started ordinary enough, the usual morning routine, the toucan's 6 o'clock arrival, the macaw's increasingly strong response. But by late morning, the sky had taken on a specific quality that long-time river residents recognized immediately, a yellowish cast beneath the clouds, a stillness in the air that felt like pressure, a change in the insects' behavior as they sought shelter en masse. The woman noticed, but didn't act immediately. False alarms were common. The forest threatened constantly, but delivered on those threats irregularly. She continued her work, checking the fish traps, bringing in laundry that had been drying on a line stretched between two posts. But she kept one eye on the sky, watched the river's surface for changes in current or color. The toucan appeared again just after noon, hours outside his normal schedule. This alone was significant, a break in pattern that suggested urgency. His call was different too, sharper, more insistent, repeated at shorter intervals. He moved erratically between branches, his large body creating unusual motion in the cecropia's flexible limbs. When the woman emerged to investigate, he didn't flee as he normally did if she appeared during his visits. Instead, he called directly at her, his beak pointed upstream where the sky was darkening from yellow to bruised purple. The wind arrived first, preceding the rain by several minutes. It came from an unusual direction, not following the river valley but cutting across it, bringing the smell of disturbed earth and broken vegetation from miles away. The temperature dropped noticeably, quickly, the kind of sudden change that meant serious weather systems colliding. Leaves began tearing free from branches, spiraling upward in small tornadoes of green. The woman moved fast now, her earlier caution converted to action. She brought in everything loose from outside, tools, baskets, the remaining laundry. She secured the shutters, tying them tight with rope she kept specifically for this purpose. She checked the stilts that held the house above normal flood level, though she knew there was nothing to be done if the water rose too high. Then she turned to the macaw. The bird was agitated, her head swiveling to track sounds, her body tense with instincts that told her to flee, but a wing that wouldn't permit flight. The woman lifted the entire basket, macaw included, and carried it to the highest corner of the single room that served as her living space. She spoke softly, uselessly, knowing the bird couldn't understand words, but hoping the tone conveyed something settling. The rain hit like a physical blow. The sound on the tin roof was immediately deafening, making conversation impossible, turning the world into a roar of water on metal. Visibility outside dropped to a grey wall of falling water. The woman couldn't see the river anymore, couldn't see the tree line, couldn't see anything beyond the porch's edge. The toucan appeared at the window, clinging to the outside of the shutters, rain streaming off his feathers. His presence there was impossible. No bird should be flying in this. No bird should be exposing itself voluntarily to this level of danger. But there he was, somehow maintaining position despite wind that was bending mature trees. He called out, a sound barely audible over the rain but visible in the opening of his beak, the expansion of his throat. The woman started to move toward the window, but stopped when she heard a different sound beneath the rain's roar, a deep, sustained grinding. She knew that sound. River ice didn't exist here, but the noise of massive objects tumbling in floodwater was unmistakable. She ran to the back window, the one facing upstream, and through a gap in the shutter saw what she'd feared, a wall of brown water, easily 12 feet high, churning with debris, whole trees, roof sections, animal carcasses, all of it tumbling in the current's grip. The flash flood hit the house 3 seconds later. The building shuddered, held, then tilted. The woman heard wood cracking, not the house itself, but one of the support stilts. The entire structure shifted several inches to the left. Water began pouring through gaps in the floorboards that had never been a problem before, fountaining up in thin streams. The woman grabbed the macaw's basket and held it against her chest, her other hand reaching for a roof beam to steady herself as the floor tilted further. Through the chaos, the toucan remained at the window, but now he was pointing with his entire body, beak extended toward something the woman couldn't see through the rain. He called again, that same urgent cry, and began moving along the shutter edge toward the front of the house. The woman followed his movement, understanding without words that he was trying to tell her something. She made it to the front window, looked where the toucan was pointing. Through the rain she could barely make out shapes, the highest trees in the immediate area, the ones on a slight rise that might be above the water if it continued rising. The toucan launched from the shutter, fought against the wind, managed to reach the nearest tall tree. He perched there, clearly visible despite the rain, and called back toward the house. The water was ankle-deep inside now and rising fast. The house tilted another few inches. The woman made her decision instantly, driven by instincts older than thought. She wrapped the macaw's basket in a piece of canvas to protect it from the worst of the rain, tied it shut with cord, then tied the entire bundle across her body. She forced open the front door against the wind's pressure and stepped out onto the porch. The current was already there, swirling around the house's stilts, carrying debris that knocked against the wood with hollow thuds. The woman didn't hesitate. She jumped. The water caught her immediately, colder than expected despite the air's warmth. She fought to keep the macaw above the surface, using one arm to shield the bundle while the other arm tried to swim. The current pulled her downstream, away from the house, but also toward the rise where the tall tree stood. She let it take her, knowing fighting was useless, focusing only on keeping her head up and the macaw dry. Something large bumped against her leg underwater. A log or animal, she couldn't tell. She kicked away from it, felt her foot connect with something solid, used that contact to push herself slightly left toward where the current eddied near the tree line. Her foot touched bottom briefly. She pushed hard, gained a few feet, lost them again as the current caught her. Then hands grabbed her arm. Another person, a man, braced against a tree trunk that was half submerged. He pulled hard, dragging her into the calmer water behind the trunk. Together they struggled up the slight rise, water still swirling around their knees but no longer with enough force to knock them down. The woman collapsed against a tree root, chest heaving, the macaw's bundle still clutched against her. Above them, somehow, the toucan was there. He'd moved from tree to tree, staying ahead of them, calling out continuously. Now he perched on a low branch directly above, rain streaming off his feathers. his distinctive profile unmistakable even in the grey light. The flood continued rising for another hour before it peaked. The woman's house didn't survive. The last support stilt broke, and the entire structure twisted sideways and was carried away, tumbling end over end until it broke apart into component pieces that scattered across half a mile of river. The woman watched it go from her perch on the high ground. The man who'd helped her, a neighbor from 3 houses upriver who'd also fled to this rise, sitting beside her in silence. The macaw had survived the swim. When the woman finally opened the canvas bundle, expecting to find a drowned bird, she found instead feathers wet but intact, eyes alert, body trembling, but alive. The basket had kept enough air inside to protect her. The woman cradled the bird against her chest, sharing body heat, and wept for reasons that went beyond the loss of her home. The toucan stayed with them through the flood's peak and through the long afternoon that followed as the water gradually receded. He moved between trees but never went far, never disappeared from sight. When night came, and the forest filled with the sounds of displaced animals trying to re-establish territories, the toucan roosted directly above where the woman had fashioned a crude shelter from branches and palm fronds. His presence was deliberate, his protection was real, even if limited to the awareness that comes from vigilance. In the morning, when the water had pulled back to reveal a landscape transformed, trees stripped, banks eroded, debris scattered across acres, the toucan gave one more call. Then he led the way back toward what had been the woman's home, flying low, following a path through the devastation that avoided the worst of the mud and tangled vegetation. The forest looked wounded. Everywhere the woman looked, she saw damage. Trees leaning at impossible angles, their root systems partially torn free, branches broken and hanging, leaves stripped in massive patches that left canopy gaps. The smell was intense, mud and rot and disturbed earth, underlaid with the sweeter scent of crushed vegetation. The sounds were different too. Fewer birds calling, and those that did sounded disoriented, their territorial songs replaced with simpler contact calls as they searched for displaced flock members. The macaw reacted to every distant crack and snap, her body tensing in the basket the woman carried. Her eyes stayed wide, pupils dilated despite the morning light. Each unfamiliar sound triggered a physical memory, the storm that had destroyed her nest playing itself out again in her nervous system. The woman felt the bird's rapid heartbeat through the basket's woven sides and spoke softly, uselessly, knowing comfort was beyond reach but offering it anyway. The site where the house had stood was marked only by the remaining stilts, 3 of them still upright, leaning at angles, and 1 reduced to a splintered stump. Everything else was gone. The woman stood there for several minutes, her face expressionless, cataloguing the loss without visible emotion. Her fishing nets, her tools, her clothes, the small collection of photographs she'd kept in a tin box, all of it scattered somewhere downstream or buried in mud. The neighbor who'd helped her during the flood had returned to check his own property. She was alone again except for the macaw and the toucan, who perched on one of the remaining stilts and watched her with what might have been patience or might have been simple bird stillness. The woman began the practical work of survival. She salvaged what she could from the debris field, a few cooking pots wedged in branches, some rope tangled around a tree trunk, boards that might be usable for rebuilding. She worked methodically, establishing a pile of recovered items on ground high enough to be safe from any immediate water rise. The macaw stayed in her basket nearby, positioned in shade, head swiveling to track the woman's movements. Over the next days, a pattern emerged from the chaos. The woman built a temporary shelter closer to the tree line on higher ground, using salvaged materials and fresh-cut palm fronds. It wasn't much, barely enough to keep rain off, but it was something. She re-established basic routines, checking what remained of her fishing traps, foraging for fruits and edible plants, treating water from the river before drinking. And she continued caring for the macaw, whose recovery had been set back by the trauma of the flood, but who remained alive, alert, determined in some indefinable way. The toucan adjusted his routine too. He no longer came at precisely 6. Perhaps his internal clock had been disrupted, or perhaps the changed landscape required different timing. But he came each morning, and he stayed longer now. Sometimes he brought food. Sometimes he just perched nearby, his presence a constant in a world that had proven itself violently inconstant. The macaw began moving more, not flying. Her wing still wasn't ready for that, but pulling herself around the temporary shelter using her beak and feet, in the characteristic parrot-climbing motion. She started with just a few inches at a time, hauling herself to the basket's edge, then back to center. Days passed, and the distance increased. She made it to the shelter's edge, peered out at the changed forest, retreated. The next day she ventured onto the ground itself, claws gripping mud still soft from recent rain. The toucan watched these attempts with what looked like approval, though the woman cautioned herself against reading too much into animal behavior. Still, she couldn't deny the pattern. When the macaw made progress, the toucan would call, a specific sound, different from his usual greeting. When the macaw struggled or retreated, he remained silent but didn't leave. His attention was consistent, focused, somehow encouraging, even if that word felt too human, too loaded with intention that might not exist. One morning, the woman woke to find both birds outside the shelter. The macaw had somehow made it down the 3-foot drop from the shelter floor to the ground, a journey that must have been terrifying given her limited mobility. She stood on the mud, body rigid, wings held tight, clearly uncertain what came next. The toucan perched on a low branch directly in front of her, maybe 6 feet away. For several minutes they simply looked at each other. The woman stayed inside the shelter, watching through gaps in the palm frond walls, barely breathing. The forest conducted its usual morning symphony, insects humming, birds calling, howler monkeys roaring in the distance. But in that small clearing, in the space between the two birds, there was a different quality to the silence. Intentional, connected. Then the toucan did something the woman had never seen. He lowered his head, bowing forward until his massive beak nearly touched the branch. He held the position for several seconds, then straightened and called, that same encouraging sound he'd made during the macaw's previous attempts at movement. The macaw responded with a sound that was stronger than any she'd made since the rescue, clearer, more sustained. The woman understood she was witnessing something significant, though she couldn't have explained what exactly. Not courtship. These were different species, and the interactions didn't carry that particular energy. Not parent-child relationship either, despite the protective overtones. Something else. Something that didn't fit the categories she knew. Over the following weeks, the forest began its recovery. New growth appeared with shocking speed, fresh shoots pushing up through mud, vines sending out exploratory tendrils, opportunistic plants racing to claim newly opened canopy gaps. The insects returned in force, their populations exploding with access to fresh vegetation. The birds followed, moving back into territories, re-establishing boundaries, beginning the complex work of rebuilding nests and social structures. The macaw's wing improved. The woman could track the progress by watching the bird's movements. The awkward angle gradually corrected. The wing began opening wider during preening sessions, the bird carefully cleaning each feather, with an attention that spoke to instinct reasserting itself. One morning, the macaw spread both wings fully for the first time since the injury, holding them extended for a full minute before folding them back with visible exhaustion. The toucan was there that morning. He called immediately when the wings opened, a sound that carried excitement even to human ears. The macaw held the position a few seconds longer, as if in response, before the effort became too much. The woman began moving the macaw's basket closer to the forest edge each day, gradually increasing the bird's exposure to the world she'd been torn from. The sounds, the smells, the visual complexity of the canopy, all of it was necessary for a full recovery, the woman reasoned. Or perhaps she was simply preparing them both for the inevitability of separation. The macaw couldn't live in a basket forever. Either she would recover enough to return to the wild, or she wouldn't. And if she didn't, the woman would face difficult decisions about what came next. But something in the toucan's continued presence suggested a different possibility. He'd begun bringing other birds around, not intentionally perhaps, but his regular appearances attracted attention. Other toucans appeared occasionally, curious about the unusual behavior. Parrots and parakeets passed through, investigating the scarlet macaw, with calls that ranged from territorial challenges to simple curiosity. The macaw responded to these visits with increasing confidence, her vocalizations gaining complexity, her body language showing less fear and more engagement. One afternoon, a male macaw appeared. He landed in a tree at the clearing's edge, his scarlet plumage brilliant in a shaft of sunlight. He called out, a typical macaw greeting, loud and assertive. The injured female responded immediately, her entire body orienting toward the sound. The exchange continued for several minutes, the male gradually moving closer, the female becoming increasingly animated. The toucan watched from his usual perch but didn't interfere. When the male macaw finally departed, flying off through the canopy with powerful wing beats, the female attempted to follow. She launched from the ground, wings beating hard, and achieved maybe 2 feet of height before pain and weakness forced her down. The landing was rough, her injured wing buckling slightly, but she didn't cry out. She simply stood there, staring after where the male had disappeared, her body vibrating with frustrated energy. That night, the woman heard the macaw moving in her basket. Restless sounds, claws scraping woven fiber, small vocalizations that might have been practice or might have been distress. She didn't intervene, let the bird work through whatever was happening internally. In the morning, the macaw looked exhausted, but somehow more present, more focused than before. The toucan's arrival that day brought change. He landed with something in his beak, not fruit this time, but a small branch still bearing leaves. He placed it carefully on the ground between himself and where the macaw stood outside her basket. Then he made a sound the woman had never heard from him, a low, almost melodic series of notes that sounded less like a call and more like a song. The macaw approached the branch. She examined it closely, running her beak along its length, testing the leaves' texture. Then she picked it up, carried it awkwardly back to her basket, and began working it into the basket's edge. The behavior of a bird building a nest, even though the basket was nothing like a proper nesting site, and the season was all wrong for such activity. The woman watched this and felt something shift in her understanding. The toucan wasn't just keeping the macaw company. He was teaching her to remember, teaching her that she was still a bird, still possessed of instincts and capabilities that went beyond simple survival, teaching her perhaps that recovery meant more than just healing physical damage. It meant rebuilding the complex web of behaviors and responses that made up a life. But there was something else too, something the woman sensed without being able to articulate. The toucan was preparing for something. His visits had taken on a different quality in recent days, less casual observation and more purposeful presence. He stayed longer but was also more active, moving between trees, calling in different directions, occasionally disappearing for hours before returning. It felt like scouting, like searching. One morning he appeared with a young toucan, barely out of juvenile plumage, awkward in its movements, with a beak that was still growing into its adult proportions. The older toucan positioned the youngster carefully on a branch, within view of the macaw, then made a series of soft calls that clearly communicated instruction. The young toucan attempted to mimic the calls, producing sounds that were similar but rougher, less refined. The adult corrected, demonstrated again, waited for another attempt. For the first time, the woman saw explicit gentleness in the interaction. When the young toucan nearly fell while trying to reach for fruit, the adult moved quickly, using his chest to brace the youngster against the branch, his large beak positioned to provide counterbalance. The movement was precise, practiced, tender in a way that transcended species, and spoke to something fundamental about care and teaching. The macaw watched this interaction with obvious interest, her head tilted at an angle that suggested intense focus. When the young toucan finally managed to successfully grip and eat a piece of fruit, the adult called out, that same encouraging sound he'd used with the macaw, and the macaw, impossibly, made the same sound back. Not perfectly, not with the same tonal quality, but recognizably the same pattern. The woman felt her eyes burning with tears she didn't fully understand. Something was happening here that went beyond simple animal behavior. These 3 birds, different species, different ages, different histories, were creating something together. A structure built not from branches and leaves, but from attention and persistence and whatever passed for hope in the animal world. That afternoon, the sky took on the same yellowish quality that had preceded the flood. But this time, the storm that followed was gentler, steady rain rather than deluge, wind that bent trees but didn't break them. The woman brought the macaw's basket inside the shelter, secured what needed securing, then sat in the doorway to watch. The toucan appeared through the rain, the young one following close behind. They perched together on a partially sheltered branch, water streaming off their feathers, but made no move to seek better protection. Instead, they called out regularly, the adult's voice deep and strong, the juvenile's higher and less certain. The calls weren't directed at anything specific. They were simply assertions of presence, "We are here, we are here, we are here." The macaw responded from inside the shelter, her voice joining the pattern, and the woman, listening to this unlikely chorus, understood finally what the toucan had been doing all along. He hadn't been visiting out of curiosity or random chance. He'd been building a bridge, creating a connection across the space that separated injury from health, captivity from freedom, despair from possibility. The rain continued through the night and into the next morning. When it finally stopped, the forest emerged transformed again, not damaged this time, but renewed, colors brighter, sounds sharper, the air carrying that particular clarity that comes after sustained rain. The woman stepped outside to find the macaw already out of her basket, standing in a patch of sunlight, both wings fully extended in a drying posture that looked almost like celebration. The toucan arrived moments later. But this time he didn't land near the shelter. Instead, he perched high in a nearby tree and called down, a sound that was clearly invitation. The macaw looked up, body tensing with familiar, frustrated energy. She beat her wings experimentally, the injured one moving with less pain than it had in weeks. She crouched, preparing to launch, then stopped. Not yet, still not ready. The toucan called again, more insistent. The young toucan appeared beside him, adding its voice to the invitation. The macaw took several running steps forward, wings beating, and this time achieved real height, 3 feet 4, 5, before settling back down. Progress. Unmistakable progress. Over the next week, the pattern repeated with increasing success. Each morning, the toucan would arrive and call from progressively higher perches. The macaw would attempt to reach him, her flights gaining distance and altitude each day. The woman watched this with mixed emotions: pride at the bird's recovery, grief at the approaching loss, and something else she couldn't quite name. Gratitude, perhaps, for being permitted to witness something she knew was rare. On a morning when the light was particularly soft and golden, filtered through morning mist rising from the river, the moment finally came. The toucan called from a high branch, the same invitation he'd been offering for days. The macaw launched without hesitation, wings beating strong and sure, and this time she didn't stop at 5 feet or 10 or 20. She climbed steadily, circling once around the clearing, her red plumage brilliant against the green canopy, then landed on the branch beside the toucan. They stayed there for several minutes, two birds side by side, making soft sounds the woman couldn't hear from the ground. Then they launched together, flying not away but in a wide circle around the clearing, once, twice, 3 times, before heading toward the deeper forest. The woman stood in the clearing, shading her eyes against the morning sun, watching until they disappeared into the canopy. She felt the tears on her cheeks, but didn't wipe them away. Something had ended. Something else had begun, and she'd been part of it in ways she was still struggling to understand. The toucan returned one more time 3 days later, but this visit was different from all that had come before. He arrived earlier than his usual schedule, when the forest was just beginning its morning awakening, and the river was still dark as polished stone. The woman heard his call and emerged from her shelter to find him perched on one of the remaining stilts from her destroyed house, his body angled not toward the shelter, but toward the forest. He called again, that same sound he'd used for weeks now, the one the woman had come to recognize as intention rather than simple vocalization. Then he took flight, moving low through the trees, following a path that led deeper into the forest, away from the river. He paused after maybe 50 feet, perched on a visible branch, and called back toward the woman. The meaning was unmistakable. Follow. The woman hesitated only briefly. She pulled on her boots, rubber ones salvaged from the flood debris, and grabbed a machete more from habit than necessity. Then she followed. The toucan led her through the recovering forest at a pace that was clearly calibrated for human movement. He'd fly ahead, wait, call when she was close, then continue. The path wasn't random. He avoided the worst of the mud and tangled debris, chose routes that were clear enough for walking. The woman picked her way carefully, alert for the snakes that would be abundant after the flood, for unstable ground, for any of the 100 small dangers that the forest held. They walked for maybe 20 minutes, the distance difficult to judge in the forest's complexity, where sightlines rarely extended beyond a few dozen yards. The canopy began changing, the trees growing taller and more densely packed. They were entering old-growth forest now, the kind of territory that had escaped logging and major storm damage, where trees could reach their full height and the understory developed the complexity that comes from stable conditions over decades. The toucan made a final turn around a particularly massive trunk, a sama-uma, one of the emergent giants that defined the Amazon's highest canopy layer. The tree was ancient, its trunk easily 15 feet in diameter, its roots spreading across the forest floor like the buttresses of a cathedral. Recent storm damage had opened a deep fissure in one side, a split that ran vertically for maybe 10 feet before the wood remained solid. The toucan landed on a root near the fissure's base and called once more. That encouraging sound, the one he'd used when the macaw made progress, when the young toucan succeeded at a task. The woman approached slowly, uncertain what she was supposed to be seeing. The fissure's interior was dark, difficult to read in the forest's dim light. Then she heard it, a weak, high-pitched sound coming from deep inside the split. Not the toucan, something else, something small and in distress. The woman knelt beside the opening, letting her eyes adjust to the darkness. Gradually, shapes emerged from shadow, branches and debris wedged into the fissure's bottom, creating a sort of nest or collection point for storm-carried material. And there, partially buried in leaves and bark, a shape that didn't belong. Another macaw, a juvenile too young to survive on its own, its feathers still carrying the duller coloration of immaturity. The bird was alive, but barely, its breathing rapid and shallow, its body temperature too low, its eyes only partially open. How it had survived this long was unclear. Perhaps the fissure had provided just enough shelter, perhaps the collection of debris had insulated it, perhaps simple chance and stubbornness had been enough. The woman reached in carefully, her hands mapping the space before committing to movement. She felt the bird's body, lighter than it should be, the bones too prominent beneath thin flesh and feathers. She lifted it gently, cradling it against her chest the same way she'd cradled the adult macaw weeks before. The juvenile made a sound that was more air than voice, but was unmistakably relief. She looked up at the toucan, who remained perched on the root, watching. Understanding finally clicked into place with such force that she actually gasped. The toucan hadn't been visiting the adult macaw out of random companionship. He'd been watching, learning, understanding that the woman could help, that she had the capability to keep alive things the forest couldn't protect on its own. He'd lost his own companions to the storm's violence, but instead of withdrawing into isolation, instead of accepting loss as inevitable, he'd chosen to do something about the next loss he encountered. He'd found this juvenile, somehow recognized its connection to the adult macaw. Perhaps they'd been from the same general territory. Perhaps the adult's calls during her recovery had reached this youngster's ears, and he'd kept watch over it while simultaneously guiding the adult through her own recovery. Now, with the adult healed and the juvenile discovered, he'd brought the woman here, not asking, not begging, simply showing, here is another thing that needs what you can give. Here is another life at the edge of ending that might be pulled back with care and time and patience. The woman felt tears sliding down her face again, but this time she understood them completely. She was crying for the same reason she'd cried weeks ago when she'd first understood the toucan's persistence. Because in the vast complexity of the Amazon, where every creature fought for survival with whatever tools evolution had provided, this bird had chosen trust, had chosen to believe that care existed, that help was possible, that connections across species could matter in ways that transcended instinct. She looked at the juvenile macaw in her hands, too weak to resist, too young to understand what was happening, alive only because a toucan had decided not to accept another loss. Then she looked back at the bird who'd led her here, who was even now preparing to launch back into the canopy where he belonged. "Thank you," she said quietly, knowing the words meant nothing to him but needing to say them anyway. The toucan tilted his head, regarded her with one eye, then spread his wings. He called once more, a sound she'd come to know intimately over these past weeks, and lifted off. He didn't fly away. Instead, he circled once overhead, his distinctive silhouette briefly visible against a patch of sky where the canopy opened, then disappeared into the green complexity above. The woman stood there for another minute, the juvenile macaw warming slowly against her chest, listening to the forest's endless conversation of bird calls and insect hums and wind through leaves. Then she turned and began the walk back toward her temporary shelter, already planning what the juvenile would need. Warmth first, then water, then food carefully calibrated for its age and condition. She'd done this before, just weeks ago. She knew the pattern now, knew what was possible. Behind her, deep in the forest's interior, the adult macaw called out, one of those long, complex vocalizations that carried across miles of canopy, announcing territory and seeking contact. From a different direction, another macaw answered, life continuing, patterns rebuilding, the forest constantly creating itself anew from whatever materials remained. The woman carried the juvenile home through morning light that was growing stronger and warmer by the minute. The river beside her shelter was running clear again. Its flood-stage chaos subsided back into the steady flow that defined this place. She settled the young macaw into a basket lined with soft cloth, positioned in shade, but within reach of warmth. The bird's eyes were clearer now, responding to the change in circumstances with what might have been curiosity, or might have been simply the beginning of stability after sustained crisis. Over the next days, the toucan appeared occasionally, but not with his previous regularity. Sometimes he'd bring fruit, dropping it near the shelter before departing. Sometimes he'd simply call from the canopy and move on. His role was finished. He'd done what he could do, built the connection, facilitated the care, ensured that both macaws had access to what they needed. Now the work of recovery belonged to the birds themselves and to the woman who'd proven herself capable of providing sanctuary. The adult macaw visited once, a week after her final flight from the clearing. She appeared suddenly in late afternoon, landing on a low branch near the shelter, with the kind of precise control that spoke to fully recovered capability. She peered inside, where the juvenile was gaining strength daily, and made a series of soft sounds, contact calls, checking in, establishing connection. The juvenile responded immediately, its voice stronger now, though still carrying the tonal qualities of immaturity. The adult stayed for maybe 10 minutes, preening herself while keeping one eye on the younger bird. Then she launched upward with powerful wing beats and was gone, disappearing into the canopy so quickly it was as if she'd never been there. But the juvenile remained agitated for hours afterward, calling periodically, responding to sounds from the forest that the woman couldn't identify. On a morning when the mist was particularly thick, when the forest seemed to exist in layers of grey and green that faded into indefinite distance, the toucan appeared one last time. He didn't come to the shelter, but perched instead on the highest point of the remaining stilts, the same spot he'd used for his very first visits weeks ago. He called out his familiar greeting, the sound that had structured so many dawns, that had become the marker of his presence and intention. The woman emerged to acknowledge him. She raised one hand, a gesture he wouldn't understand, but that felt necessary anyway. Recognition, gratitude, farewell. The toucan called once more, a sound that might have been answer, or might have been simple continuation of his morning routine. Then he spread his wings, the yellow-orange beak catching the early light, and lifted off. He flew not away but in a wide circle around the clearing, the same pattern the adult macaw had traced during her recovery flights. Once around, twice, 3 times, the number felt significant, though the woman knew better than to assign meaning that might not exist. On the 4th circle, he began climbing, rising through layers of canopy until he reached the emergent layer where the tallest trees broke through into full sunlight. The woman watched until he disappeared completely, a black silhouette against brightness, becoming smaller and smaller until it merged with the general complexity of the upper canopy and was gone. She stood there for a while longer, listening to the forest conducting its usual business, the calls and responses that had preceded her existence here and would continue long after she was gone. Inside the shelter, the juvenile macaw rustled in its basket, trying out its wings in small practice movements that spoke to instinct asserting itself, to recovery taking hold, to the future being something other than immediate survival. The woman turned back toward the shelter, toward the daily work of care that she'd chosen, or that had chosen her. She wasn't sure anymore which was true. The river flowed past, carrying the constant message that everything moved forward, whether you were ready or not. The forest grew and died and grew again in cycles too large for individual awareness, but too insistent to ignore. And somewhere in the canopy above, a toucan flew on about its business, having done what the forest required, witnessed what needed witnessing, connected what needed connecting, insisted that even in the midst of loss and violence and endless struggle, there was room for unlikely alliances. That care could cross boundaries most creatures never thought to cross. That attention mattered. That persistence could reshape possibility. That in the vast indifferent complexity of the Amazon, individual choices could still make the difference between ending and continuing, between isolation and connection, between giving up and insisting on one more morning, one more call, one more attempt at bridging the space between separate lives. The woman understood this now in a way she hadn't before. She'd lived on this river for most of her adult life, had thought she understood how the forest worked, what it required, what it permitted. But the toucan had taught her something new, that wildness didn't mean absence of care, that sovereignty didn't require isolation, that even among creatures who never spoke in words, there could be something like kindness, deliberate, chosen, insisted upon, despite every reason to withdraw into self-protection. She would tell this story later, to neighbors who returned to rebuild after the flood, to researchers who came through mapping storm damage, to anyone who would listen. She would try to explain what had happened in that small clearing beside the river, how a toucan had chosen persistence over grief, how trust had been built across species through nothing more than consistent presence and attention. Most people would nod politely, would smile in the way that suggested they thought she was exaggerating or misinterpreting animal behavior through the lens of human emotion. But she would know better. She had the evidence. 2 macaws alive when they should have been dead, recovered when they should have remained broken. She had the memory of yellow-orange beak against morning sky, of calls that structured the passage from darkness to light, of the moment she'd understood that she'd been chosen, not randomly but deliberately, to be part of something larger than her own survival. In the Amazon, where every life depended on other lives in ways too complex to fully map, where death was constant, but so was renewal, the toucan had transformed his loss into direction, had transformed grief into purpose, had proven that even in the forest's fierce vastness, there was space for alliances that made no sense by any logic, except the logic of care itself, silent, precise, deep enough to make even a woman hardened by decades on the river cry without shame.